What I want to do is, I don't have like really great stories that you've told, Allison, but I'm just going to give you an overview of some of what we've been seeing in this citizen science and what we also call crowdsourcing community. So just to kind of reiterate what Allison was saying, I think it's important to think about how we are trying to engage and trying to make an effort to engage citizens in any part of the life cycle of the scientific process. But we often see that there's more of a focus on the data collection side. But there are examples of other ways in which we're engaging folks in other phases, but I think it's increasingly important to think of the whole part of this research process, even in the beginning of defining research questions. There's also, a huge variety of other communities that have been emerging more and more, given that there's low-cost sensors and then the rise of Internet of Things. I'm glad that David had pointed out Foldscope. I got to create one of these at a BioBlitz, and it only took a few minutes just to create, and it's pretty amazing. It's less than $1, so it's fascinating what opportunities we have right now with these efforts and sensors. There's also an emerging community called prizes and challenge competitions, at least within the federal government, and this is also expanding in many areas in the industry. And I think it's somewhat related and similar, even though this is oriented towards providing some kind of monetary compensation potentially. There's also other kind of prizes that are maybe non-monetary. But I think a great example is EPA's Smart City Air Challenge that's going on right now, where it's about 100,000 in prizes. So not a huge amount like some of the $1 million prize competitions, but really just a great way to integrate not only a little bit of citizen science, but also low-cost sensors and Internet of Things and data science and looking at that data. One of the things I want to point out, though, as it was reiterated before, is that even though we say citizen science, I think a lot of this work, especially when you start to think of crowdsourcing or crowd mapping efforts, the impact is beyond science. And these are just some of my favorite examples. MapGive is a great way in which you get volunteers just to edit a map on OpenStreetMap, and it's a really great way to help responders on the ground who are dealing with a disaster, such as in Haiti or in this case Ebola. The other one I thought was very interesting is FCC's speed test. So this is a great way to ground truth mobile broadband speed. Now, I want to kind of reiterate what Luigi mentioned earlier. There's a variety of citizen science associations now, including those in Europe. So Luigi actually helps work at the European Citizen Science Association. There's also the Australian one, which had some recent conferences, and there's also an upcoming citizen science conference in May in St. Paul, Minnesota, so I recommend checking that out. Now, one of the things that I wanted to offer, coming from a federal community perspective, is that we've been, over the last few years, working on developing citizenscience.gov. It's a great resource for 3 different kind of components, which I'll just briefly go over here. We've got this federal crowdsourcing citizen science catalog, which was in partnership with the Wilson Center and GSA. So it's a great way to show a little over our 300 projects that we have from 25 agencies. We're trying to keep this a living document and continue to show what the projects are for the federal community to learn more and create more of these projects, but also for volunteers and other folks to learn more about these projects. We also developed a federal crowdsourcing and citizen science toolkit. So this is a way to bring together all the different resources on how to develop and create and design a crowdsourcing or citizen science project, as well as some case studies to provide some success stories and learn from what has happened in the past from long-standing types of projects. There's also a community component. So I co-chair the Federal Community of Practice for Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science. We have monthly meetings and other ways in which we engage with each other on a listserv. But we also have these agency citizen science and crowdsourcing coordinators. So this was sort of in response to the, which I'll talk about a little more later, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy memo on looking at and embracing more crowdsourcing and science efforts. So this is a way to encourage agencies to identify coordinator to help institutionalize almost these growing participatory science efforts. So just to give you a glimpse at some of these federal, what I call open innovation policies, and that's sort of a broader term that I'd like to say, because I think sometimes we can narrow ourselves in one area. And some of these policies help to bring it together in somewhat more of an umbrella fashion. The 2015 Office of Management Budget and OSDP memo specifically encourage agencies to foster innovation through not only just the grand challenges and incentive prizes like I mentioned earlier, but citizen science and in collaboration with members of the Maker Movement. So I'm really glad that we are here today with this summit to really actually make that happen even more so. There was also, like I mentioned before, this 2015 OSTP memo, and there was also a Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act as well. So I think this is a great way in which we're seeing how the federal government and how we as a community are trying to institutionalize these efforts more and more, and we're getting a response from a policy standpoint, which I think is really important. But there are some citizen science challenges, and so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I think one of the things in being a part of this community is learning more about what are those citizen science misconceptions, and I really want to credit Karen Cooper, who's done a great job in presenting this in the past. I've just created an adapted version and shortened it for this talk, but everyone always brings up data quality. How can you trust data from the public? Well, I actually worked on a project, and I'll talk about later in a later panel, but sometimes you often can use crowdsourcing or citizen science to ground truth science, to make our science better. So I think there's often a misconception around data quality. But we're going to talk about it in that panel later on. Also, people think, oh, this is free labor. You've got volunteers, they're not being paid, so it's going to be free, it's not going to cost you a lot. It does cost something to really organize all these efforts, the logistics around it. But also there are many examples in which there's compensation being provided in other ways. For example, we work with people with special disabilities, or I call abilities, many of which are young adults who have some kind of autism, and we encourage them, during their volunteer time at USGS, we give them these crowdsourcing and science projects, and then in the end we hope to offer them a temporary position at USGS. So a different way in which to think about compensation and mutual benefits. Sorry. And then the other aspect, as was mentioned before, is this is a new concept. Well, no, it's not. We've seen examples in the past of how this has been going on, basically how science started. But I think we need to, this is just a buzzword essentially is what's happening. Is it just public outreach? Well, yes, sometimes crowdsourcing citizen science gets bucketed into public outreach, but it's much more than that. And I think that's where, if we start to talk with our volunteers more, we start to realize the much broader benefits that exist, that are just beyond outreach. Always nature observations. Well, coming from U.S. Geological Survey, yes, we do a lot of natural observations, but there's so many other examples of ways in which we can engage the public, and I think we've seen some, and if you start to look in other areas outside of the environmental realm, I think it becomes very obvious. And then lastly, only engaging with scientists. And I think sometimes citizen science already frames us in a certain way, and I think there are ways in which this stuff has been happening for a long time when you start to engage or work in community-based kinds of projects that aren't just about science. It's about affecting policy or some kind of activism potentially. Now, there's also some ethical and legal issues. I think it's important to consider what kind of active or passive involvement do you have in engaging citizens. One project that I worked on was Tweet Earthquake Dispatch, where we mine Twitter for any time people tweet about an earthquake. And basically, we could detect earthquakes fairly quickly using this data, but we're essentially crowd harvesting, or just harvesting existing data from social media. So that involvement is a little different. But if you are involving more folks, especially collecting personally identifiable information, that's where it becomes important to think about confidentiality, but also considering, the citizens are contributing their information. How can we make sure we give it back to those that contributed? So I think finding ways in which to develop more data sharing agreements is really important. Thinking about copyright, intellectual property aspects, but also considering that we're in an open data movement, that the value of this data is often when you make it open and available in certain ways to address a variety of issues. And lastly, there's interesting efforts, and this is just one example of how, to recognize the volunteers through attributing them through co-authorship, for example, since a lot of this is more for scientists. But I think there's other ways in which we can recognize the contributions of volunteers. Lastly, I just want to say there's a growing interest to figure out how can we evaluate citizen science projects. There's the science of citizen science, as Andrea has pointed out in her efforts, and so I think there's interesting issues of thinking of what's the metrics of a successful citizen science project. And I think it's important to think of how are we marketing to these volunteers that we want, and what are their motivations? And I think that can also provide some insights on how we evaluate the impact of these projects. And lastly, just to kind of reiterate, there are mutual benefits for volunteers, and not just to scientists, but thinking more broadly outside of these projects. Some of these aren't just science projects. It's just more about how can we do an open call that might actually be the only way in which we can get this kind of data, or the only way in which we can have these insights, whatever it might be. So with that, I wanted to kind of just give you one example. I think there's been some growing efforts in thinking about how can we evaluate these approaches. The University of Washington researchers analyzed 338 citizen science biodiversity projects, and they basically found that about 1.3 to 2.3 million volunteers have an economic value of $2.5 billion per year. And I think that's really interesting. It's still kind of like, how do I understand that? And I think economic value is just one of many ways to consider what's the value of citizens. And just lastly, I like creating my own acronym, but I hope we do stop these challenges, but in this way of thinking of, what are the socio-cultural challenges, the technological challenges, the organizational challenges, as well as the political or policy challenges. We now have a variety of technology available to us, and it's amazing the possibilities right now, but that's usually not the problem. That's usually much farther ahead than where we can be. It's really sometimes the organizational practices, the cultural differences, the policies that sometimes are impeding these efforts. And so hopefully as we discuss some of these challenges in the maker and citizen science community, we consider the variety of aspects of the challenges that face us.